December 1884, at the abandoned Decker S. Crossing Depot in Wyoming Territory. The door burst open, and a towering cowboy stepped through the blizzard as Eleanor shivered beside a dead stove. "You got somewhere to go?" he demanded, snow melting across his hardened face. Eleanor tightened her fingers around her battered suitcase. "I have 43 cents and nowhere left in this world." Silas' stern expression faltered. He threw his warm coat around her shoulders and locked eyes with her. "Stay here, and you freeze," he said. "Come with me. You need a home, and my children need a mother." But could a marriage between two strangers save a broken family or destroy them all? Stay with us. Subscribe and discover how Eleanor's impossible journey begins. The last train out of Laramie left at 2:30. Eleanor Hayes watched it go. She stood on the platform of the Deckers Crossing Depot and listened to the iron wheels screech against the rails until the sound disappeared into the white. Nothing. The wind came in right after, filling the silence with something colder and meaner. It pushed through the gaps in the depot's wooden walls like it had a personal grudge. She sat down on her suitcase. That was everything she owned. One battered leather case, 43 cents in her coat pocket, and a pair of wool gloves with the left thumb worn clean through. Margaret Hayes, her late husband's mother, had pressed those coins into her palm at the station in Denver, not out of kindness. More the way you toss bread at a pigeon you want to stop following you. "Take yourself somewhere," Eleanor, the old woman, had said. "Somewhere far. You've got nothing left here." She hadn't been wrong. Thomas was 6 months in the ground. The house, the savings, the furniture, all of it had gone to his brothers under a will that Eleanor had never seen until the morning after the funeral. She'd spent 4 months fighting it, hired a lawyer with money she'd borrowed, lost anyway. The final insult came at the Denver station. Margaret's parting words, delivered with the calm certainty of a judge reading a sentence. "Barren and useless," said it out loud, right there on the platform, in front of 2 railroad porters and a woman traveling with a baby on her hip. Eleanor had not cried. She'd gotten on the northbound train instead. She wasn't entirely sure why she'd gotten off at Decker's Crossing. The ticket had taken her last dollar and change, and this was simply where the money ran out. A depot in the middle of Wyoming Territory, December. The kind of cold that didn't feel like cold anymore. It felt like pressure, like the air itself was pushing in from all sides. She tucked her hands under her arms and watched the snow come down outside the depot window. The stove in the corner had gone out an hour ago. The station master had locked his office and gone home before the storm turned serious. There was no one else, just Eleanor, the dead stove, and the sound of the blizzard working itself into something biblical outside. Think. That was what she kept telling herself. Think, Eleanor, you've gotten through worse. But she was having trouble believing that right now. The depot door blew open, not a gentle swing. A hard, full-body crash that knocked snow across the floorboards in a wide, white arc. Eleanor was on her feet before she'd made any decision to stand. A man filled the doorway. He was big, not in the exaggerated way of men who want you to notice it, but in the practical, load-bearing way of someone who has spent years doing heavy work. Sheepskin coat, frost on the collar, a hat pulled low, brim bent down against the wind. He had to turn sideways to get his shoulders through the frame. He stopped when he saw her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. He looked at her the way a person looks at something unexpected, not alarmed, just recalibrating. "Depot's closed," he said. His voice was low and flat, the way voices get when a man has spent long stretches talking to no one. "I know." He looked at the dead stove, looked at her coat, which was a respectable coat for Denver in October and a very poor coat for Wyoming in December, looked at the suitcase. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pulled off his hat and knocked the snow off it against his leg. "You got somewhere to be." Eleanor almost laughed. No, he studied her face. She got the sense he was a man who made decisions quickly and didn't waste time second-guessing them. He put his hat back on. "My name is Silas Thorne. I've got a ranch 12 miles east. I came in for supplies before this storm closed the road. He paused. Road's already closed. I see. There's a room at my place. Heat, food. He said it plainly. No softness to it. No performance of generosity. Just facts. I've got 2 children. Their mother died 3 years back. The older one's 11 and mean as a cat when she wants to be. The younger one doesn't talk. He stopped. I need someone who can hold a household together. Cook, mend, manage, in exchange for room and board and a legal arrangement that protects you. Eleanor stared at him. The wind hit the building like a fist. The walls shook. A legal arrangement, she repeated. Marriage on paper. I've got no interest in pretending it's anything else. He looked at her steadily. But my children are alone out there tonight, with a housekeeper who's 60 years old and half blind. And I've got a ranch that's going under. And you are sitting in an unheated building in a blizzard with no coat and 40 cents. He crossed the room in 4 steps, shrugged off his sheepskin coat, and dropped it around her shoulders without asking. It smelled like wood smoke and cold air and something underneath that hay, maybe, or the particular weight of honest work. It was still warm from his body. He looked her dead in the eye. Stay here, Silas said, and you'll freeze. Come with me. You need a home, and my children need a mother. The blizzard screamed against the windows. Eleanor pulled the coat tighter around her shoulders. 43 cents. A dead stove. A train that was long gone. She picked up her suitcase. All right, she said. Let's go. The circuit judge's name was Harold Finch, and he performed the wedding ceremony in his long underwear. He hadn't been expecting company. Silas had pounded on his door at 4:30 in the morning. Snow still coming down in sheets, and Judge Finch had answered in a wool cap and a nightshirt that hung to his knees. He'd looked at Silas, looked at Eleanor, looked at the blizzard behind them. Give me a minute, he'd said, and disappeared back inside. He came back with a Bible and his long underwear and a lamp. He read the words fast, the way a man reads something he said, so many times it's lost all meaning. Eleanor repeated what she was told to repeat. Silas did the same. Judge Finch signed the paper, stamped it, and handed it to Eleanor, because she was the one who looked like she'd actually keep track of it. Congratulations, he said, already closing the door. That was the wedding. They rode the 12 miles to Ironwood Ranch in the wagon with their shoulders almost touching and nothing much to say. The draft horses knew the road even through the snow. Silas held the reins loosely and kept his eyes forward. Eleanor kept hers forward too. The marriage certificate was folded in her coat pocket next to the 43 cents. She thought about Margaret Hayes, just briefly, about what the old woman would say if she could see Eleanor right now, riding through a Wyoming blizzard beside a stranger. She'd just married in front of a judge in his underwear. Eleanor decided she didn't care. The ranch came into view just before dawn. Ironwood. Even in the dark and the snow she could see, it was a serious place, a large 2-story house. Barn, bunkhouse. A network of fencing that stretched out into the white distance. It had the look of something built to last. Built by someone who intended to stay. A light was on in the kitchen window. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop and set the brake. He climbed down and came around to her side out of habit, she guessed, because he stopped himself halfway and stepped back, like he'd caught himself doing something that no longer applied. Eleanor climbed down on her own. The front door opened before they reached the porch. A woman stood in the doorway, broad-shouldered, gray-haired, apron over a house dress, lamp in her hand. She looked Eleanor over the way a person examines something they've been told to expect, but weren't sure they believed until now. Martha, Silas said. This is Eleanor. She'll be staying on. Staying on, Martha repeated. We're married. Martha looked at Eleanor for another long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Coffee's hot, she said. That was apparently all the opinion she intended to offer. Behind Martha, at the bottom of the stairs, stood a girl, 11 years old, dark hair, dark eyes. She had Silas's jaw and a look on her face that would have suited a much older person closed off. Wary, already decided. She was wearing her nightgown and holding a candle. and she was staring at Eleanor with open hostility. "Clara," Silas said, "go back to bed. Who is she?" "Her name is Eleanor. We'll talk in the morning." Clara stared at Eleanor for another 5 full seconds. Then she turned and went back up the stairs, without a word. Taking the candle with her, Eleanor set her suitcase down by the door. Silas showed her to a room at the end of the upstairs hallway. It was small, clean with a narrow bed and a window that rattled in the wind. There was a quilt on the bed and a washstand in the corner. Someone had put a small fire in the wood stove recently enough that the room still held a little heat. "My room is at the other end of the hall," Silas said. He was standing in the doorway, not coming in. "Martha's off the kitchen. Clara and Sammy are in between." "Sammy," Eleanor said, "your son, 4 years old. He was present when his mother died. He hasn't spoken since." He said it flatly. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he'd learned to carry it that way. "He's a good boy, gentle. He won't give you trouble." "What happened to her? Your wife?" Silas was quiet for a moment. "Fever started in August. Went fast. Sammy was in the room when she passed. Clara was the one who found them." He paused. "That's all I'll say on it tonight." Eleanor nodded. "The ground rules," he said. "I want to be clear about them. This is a working arrangement. You manage the house. Look after the children. Handle what Martha can't get to on her own. In return, you have a room, food, legal protection, and a share in the ranch. If things change between us down the line, that's a conversation we can have. But I won't pretend to feelings I don't have, and I won't ask you to either." "That's fair," Eleanor said. "Good." He put his hand on the doorframe. "Sleep. There's work in the morning." He pulled the door shut behind him. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the blizzard and the settling of the house. Somewhere down the hall, she could hear a child breathing in sleep. Small sounds, the sounds of a home that was hurting. She unfolded the marriage certificate and looked at it. Eleanor Thorne. The ink was barely dry. She folded it again and put it under the mattress. In the morning, she found the ranch's account ledger in the kitchen desk because Martha left it out. Or maybe because she wanted Eleanor to find it. The entries were written in Silas's careful, cramped hand. Eleanor had spent enough time looking at financial documents during her legal fight in Denver to read a ledger quickly. She read this one twice. Ironwood was drowning. The cattle numbers were down 30% from 2 years ago. There were outstanding loans at the Deckers Crossing Bank, 2 of them, both held by the same private creditor, a man named Jedediah Cross. The interest terms were written in language designed to be confusing, the kind of contract drawn up by someone who expects the other party not to read carefully. Eleanor read carefully. The rates were punishing. Cross could call the notes due with 30 days' notice, and based on the current cash position. Silas couldn't cover either of them. She was still sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger when Silas came in from the morning chores. He stopped when he saw what she was reading. "Martha shouldn't have left that out. Were you going to tell me?" He pulled off his gloves and hung them by the door. "I was going to tell you when there was something useful to say." "Who is Jedediah Cross?" Silas poured himself a cup of coffee. He stood at the counter with his back to her for a moment. "He owns the Cross Star Ranch, north of here. Biggest operation in the county. He's been buying up smaller ranches for 3 years. Most of them sell because they've got no choice. He uses the bank loans to pressure people into that position. And you borrowed from him directly." "I borrowed from the Deckers Bank. Cross bought the notes from the bank 6 months later. I didn't know until it was done." He turned around. "There's nothing illegal about it. There might not need to be," Eleanor said. "But it isn't nothing either." Silas looked at her. "You know finance law." "I know enough. I spent 2 years fighting a contested will in Denver. I learned to read contracts the hard way." She set the ledger down. "The interest rate on the second note has a compounding clause that might not hold up if it was added after the original agreement was signed. Do you have the original bank document?" Silas stared at her. "The original document," she said again, "from when you took the loan. Somewhere in the box in my office. I'd like to see it." He brought her the box after breakfast. She spent the afternoon at the kitchen table with both documents side by side, while Martha cooked and Sammy sat in the corner of the kitchen, playing quietly with a set of carved wooden horses. He was a small boy, thin-wristed and big-eyed, with his father's dark hair. He didn't speak, but twice he looked up at Eleanor with his solemn, watchful eyes, and she smiled at him, and he didn't look away. Clara came in at midday, looked at Eleanor at the table, and walked back out again. She didn't speak to Eleanor once. That was all right. Eleanor hadn't expected her to. She found what she was looking for in the original bank document just before supper. The compounding clause was written in the margin in a different pen, added later, almost certainly after the original signing. That was worth something. Maybe not enough on its own, but it was a thread worth pulling. She put both documents away carefully and went to help Martha with supper. At the table that evening, Clara sat across from Eleanor and ate in deliberate silence. Sammy sat beside his father and ate steadily, watching his wooden horses lined up along the table's edge. Silas ate and didn't force conversation. Martha put a second biscuit on Eleanor's plate without being asked. Small things. Eleanor noticed them all. After supper, when the dishes were done and the children were in bed, Silas came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Find anything?" he said. "Maybe," Eleanor said. "That compounding clause looks like it was added after the fact. If it was, it could void a significant portion of what you owe." He was quiet for a moment. "How do you prove that?" "Original ink, different pen. A handwriting analysis, if it goes to a judge. Witnesses to the original signing, if any exist." She paused. "It won't be fast, and it won't be easy." Silas looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Why are you doing this?" She thought about that, honestly. "Because I'm half owner of this land now," she said. "That's what you told me. So it's my problem, too." He nodded slowly. "Get some sleep." Eleanor, she did. And for the first time in a long while, she slept without dreaming of Denver. The first week nearly broke her. Eleanor had kept house before. She'd managed a well-staffed Denver home with a cook and a girl who came twice a week to clean. She had believed, foolishly, that this had prepared her for something. It had not. A frontier ranch in Wyoming in December was its own category of hard. The days started before dawn with a cold kitchen floor under her feet and a stove that needed rebuilding from overnight coals. Water had to be hauled from the pump before it froze solid. Laundry was done by hand in a tub of water heated on the stove and then hung to dry indoors because anything outside froze stiff in 20 minutes. The chickens needed tending. The root cellar needed checking. Martha moved through all of it with the grim efficiency of someone who had been doing it for 30 years, which only made Eleanor feel the gap in her own experience more acutely. She didn't complain. She learned fast, and she asked questions, and she made mistakes, and she fixed them. Clara watched all of this with the focused attention of someone collecting evidence. The girl was not casually hostile. She was deliberately, systematically hostile in the way that only a smart child can be. She hid Eleanor's kitchen tools in the wrong drawers. She gave Eleanor incorrect information about where things were kept, and then watched her go the wrong direction without saying anything. She answered every question with the minimum number of words legally required. Eleanor didn't push back. She corrected her course, figured things out on her own, and kept moving. But one morning, 9 days in, she came downstairs to find her good mixing bowl outside on the porch, frozen solid with a skin of ice across the top. She stood in the cold doorway holding it and understood perfectly well how it had gotten there. She went back inside and made the biscuits in a cast-iron pot instead. Clara came down 20 minutes later and saw the pot on the table and looked at Eleanor with something that flickered between guilt and defiance and landed on defiance. Eleanor put a biscuit on her plate and didn't say a word. 3 days after that, Silas rode out before sunrise to check the north fence line. A storm had rolled through the night before, and he needed to assess damage before the cattle drifted. He told Martha he'd be back before noon. He wasn't back by noon. By 2 o'clock, Eleanor was watching the window. The temperature had dropped sharply. The sky had gone the particular flat gray that preceded bad weather. Martha was in the bunkhouse checking on old Pete, the ranch's only remaining hand, who had a bad knee and worse luck. Clara was upstairs doing schoolwork. Sammy was asleep for his afternoon rest. Eleanor heard it before she saw it. A sound from outside, low, distressed. The particular call of a very young animal in trouble. She pulled on her coat and her boots and went out to the porch. 40 yards past the near fence line, barely visible in the falling snow. A newborn calf was down on its side. She could see it struggling, legs moving without purchase on the frozen ground. The mother was standing 10 feet away, pacing too spooked to approach. The calf had gotten through the fence somehow. The bottom wire was lifted just enough a section that had probably been compromised in last night's storm. Eleanor looked at the calf, looked at the fence, looked at the sky, which was getting darker and meaner by the minute. She went back inside for the heavy work gloves on the hook by the door. Martha's gloves were too small. They wouldn't go over Eleanor's hands. She grabbed them anyway, pulled them as far on as they'd go, and went back out. The calf was maybe 40 pounds, small but dead weight when it wasn't cooperating. And it wasn't cooperating. Eleanor got through the fence without much trouble and crouched down in the snow beside the animal. It was shaking badly. Its small body burning through heat it couldn't afford to lose. "All right," she said quietly. "Come on." She got her arms under it, got to her feet. The calf panicked and threw its weight sideways, and she went down hard on one knee. Catching herself with one hand in the snow, she got up again. On the second try, she had a better hold. She turned back toward the fence. The barbed wire caught her on the return bottom strand. Her right hand, where Martha's glove, didn't cover her wrist. She felt the tear across her palm before she felt the pain. She pulled through anyway, holding the calf against her chest, and the wire took another strip across the back of her left hand. For the effort, she didn't stop. She got the calf to the barn, got it into the nearest empty stall with fresh straw, got a rough blanket over it. Her hands were bleeding into her gloves by then, both of them. The right worse than the left. She wrapped them in a length of clean cloth from the supply shelf and pressed hard and went to find the mother cow, who had followed to the fence line and was standing there making anxious sounds. It took another 20 minutes to coax the cow back through the repaired section of fence and into the barn with her calf. Eleanor used every fence staple she could find to secure the damaged wire. Her hands had gone past hurting into a dull, throbbing numbness that was probably worse, medically speaking, but easier to work through. By the time she got back to the house, the snow was coming down properly. She had been outside for nearly an hour. She came in through the back door and got as far as the hearth in the main room before her legs decided they were done. She sat down on the stone floor in front of the fire, with her back against the settle and her hands in her lap, and concentrated on breathing until the shaking stopped. Clara was standing in the doorway to the hall. Eleanor hadn't heard her come down. The girl was staring, not with the cool, assessing look she usually wore, with something younger and less defended. Her eyes went to Eleanor's hands, wrapped in blood-spotted cloth, then to the snow melting off Eleanor's coat onto the hearthstones. "The calf," Eleanor said. Her voice came out rough. "It's in the barn, south stall, with its mother. It needs checking in an hour." Clara didn't move. "It's alive," Clara said. "It's alive." Another silence. Clara looked at the hands again. Then she turned and went to the kitchen and came back with a clean cloth and the small medical tin they kept on the shelf above the dry goods. She sat down on the settle without saying anything and held out her hand. Eleanor hesitated, then passed over her right hand. Clara unwrapped the cloth with more care than Eleanor expected. She cleaned the cuts the way someone had taught her, to water first. Then the iodine that stung badly enough that Eleanor had to concentrate very hard on not reacting. Clara wrapped it properly when she was done, moved to the left hand, and did the same. She didn't say she was sorry, didn't say anything about the bowl on the porch, or the misdirected instructions, or any of the 11 days of deliberate friction. She just wrapped the bandages and tied them off and put the tin away. Silas came in an hour later, cold and tired, and found Eleanor asleep, sitting up by the fire, with her bandaged hands folded in her lap. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Clara was in the kitchen, helping Martha with supper. He didn't ask what had happened. He could read a bandage. He could read the hoofprints and the disturbed snow between the house and the barn, and he'd already seen the calf. He went to the kitchen doorway. She'd do that herself. He asked Martha. I wasn't here, Martha said. Asked Clara. Silas looked at his daughter. Clara kept her eyes on the pot she was stirring, but after a moment she said, quietly, the calf would have died. Silas nodded. He went back to the main room and put another log on the fire. He sat down in the chair across from Eleanor and unlaced his boots and didn't wake her. Outside, the storm rolled through and spent itself and moved on, the way storms do. By morning, the sky was clear and hard and blue, and the snow on the fields was undisturbed and brilliant. Eleanor came down to breakfast and found Clara had already set her place at the table. Nothing was said about any of it. But when Eleanor reached past Clara for the salt and their arms briefly touched, Clara didn't pull away. January in Wyoming didn't ease up. The cold settled in and meant it. The stock pond froze 8 inches deep. The wind off the northern plain had a horizontal quality that drove snow into every gap and crack, under doors, around window frames, down the collar of your coat, no matter how tight you pulled it. Even the horses had a miserable, put-upon look about them. Silas was gone 3 days out of every 7, riding fence line and checking on the cattle scattered across Ironwood's 1,200 acres. He came back each time, looking more worn than when he left and eating whatever was on the table without comment before going over the account books in his office, with the lamp burning late into the night. Eleanor noticed he never asked for help with the books anymore. She left the Denver legal documents on the kitchen table one morning, her own notes alongside the ranch's original loan papers, with a suspicious compounding clause annotated clearly in the margin. When she came down the next morning, the documents were exactly where she'd left them, but someone had moved her candle closer so the handwriting was easier to read, and there was a fresh cup of coffee sitting beside the papers, still warm. She drank the coffee and didn't say anything either. Clara had not returned to active warfare. She had not crossed into warmth. Exactly, but the systematic sabotage was over. She did her chores without being asked twice. She taught Eleanor which of the hens was laying and which was not, and which one had a mean streak and would peck given any opportunity. Small, practical information, delivered without eye contact, in the flat tone of someone conveying useful data rather than offering friendship. Eleanor accepted all of it at exactly that value and asked follow-up questions, and occasionally, Clara answered those too. Sammy watched everything from a careful distance. He was present for every meal, for every evening by the fire, for every ordinary moment of the household day. He watched Eleanor with his large, serious eyes, and kept his own company with his carved horses and whatever was happening in the private world behind his face. He had not spoken again after the word at the train depot that Silas had described. Not in Eleanor's presence. Not, as far as she could tell, at all. She didn't push him. She included him in everything, without requiring anything back, set his horses in a row at the table, put his cup beside his plate, told him what was for supper, the same way she told Clara. She talked to him the same way she talked to everyone else, not in the high, gentle voice people sometimes used for children they felt sorry for. He seemed to notice the difference. The night it happened, Silas had ridden out at midday to help a neighboring rancher named Cole, whose cattle had drifted badly in the latest storm. He'd expected to be back by supper. He wasn't. Eleanor put supper back on the stove and kept it warm, and didn't worry, yet delays happened. Weather happened, and Silas was not a man who mismanaged his own time. Martha went to bed at 9. She was 63 and running hard on a bad hip, and Eleanor had quietly rearranged the morning chores, so Martha's work started an hour later, without being obvious about it. Martha hadn't said anything about this, but she'd started leaving a fresh square of cornbread on the table for Eleanor every night before she turned in. It was 10:30 when the horses started. Eleanor was banking the kitchen fire when she heard it, not the ordinary sounds of horses moving in their stalls. The casual shuffle and stamp, but something higher and urgent. She'd been on the ranch long enough now to hear the difference. She went to the kitchen window. The yard was bright with snow-reflected moonlight. Clear sky, near full moon. Everything washed silver and shadow. She could see clearly to the far fence line. Something was moving along the near pasture fence. Then something else, and something else. Wolves, she counted 4, then 2 more at the edge of the moonlight. They were thin winterling, ribs, showing even at this distance, and they were moving with the specific patient quality of animals that have been hungry long enough to lose their caution. The fence wasn't slowing them down. They were testing it, moving along it, looking for the weak section. They found it at the south corner. Eleanor was already moving. She went to the main room, where Silas's Winchester rifle stood in the corner rack. She'd fired it twice since arriving at Ironwood, once at Silas's instruction, once on her own when a coyote got close to the henhouse. She knew the weight of it, knew the lever, knew how it sat against her shoulder. She pulled on her coat and her boots and checked that the rifle was loaded. She opened the front door. The cold hit like a wall. But the moonlight was good, and her hands were steady, and she walked to the edge of the porch and took stock. 6 wolves in the near pasture now. The cattle in that section were bunching, lowing, moving away from the fence line in a tight, frightened mass, and at the far edge of the yard, just inside the tree line, 2 horses. Riders, sitting still, not Silas's horse. She knew Silas's horse by now. These men were watching, waiting to see what the wolves did, or what the wolves started. Cross's men. She understood that in the cold, clear way of someone whose mind sharpens under pressure. Eleanor raised the Winchester. The alpha wolf was the largest, moving slightly apart from the others, and it was already through the fence gap and into the pasture proper. She tracked it for 2 full seconds, let her breath out slow, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the night like a branch breaking. The alpha went down and didn't get up. The other wolves scattered. 3 through the gap they'd come from, 2 more in the opposite direction. 1 over the far fence in a scrambling leap. They were gone in under 30 seconds. Eleanor worked the lever. The 2 riders in the tree line hadn't moved. She raised the rifle again, adjusted her aim 3 feet to the right of the nearer rider, precisely enough to be understood, and fired. The rider's hat lifted off his head and was gone into the dark. Both men pulled their horses hard around and were gone into the trees at a run. Eleanor lowered the rifle. Her breath was coming in visible clouds in the moonlit cold. The cattle were still moving, still upset. But the wolves were gone, and the riders were gone, and the yard was quiet again. Behind her, the front door opened. She turned. Sammy was standing in the doorway in his nightgown, bare feet on the wooden porch floor, his small face white with alarm. He must have come down the stairs at the shot. He'd made it all the way to the door. He looked at Eleanor, looked at the rifle, looked at the moonlit yard with the shapes of the spooked cattle moving in the distance. Eleanor set the rifle against the porch rail and crouched down to his level. "It's all right," she said. "They're gone. Everyone's all right." Sammy stood very still. His feet had to be freezing. His eyes were wide, searching her face with an intensity she recognized, looking for the truth, not the reassuring version of it. "Cold," he said, 1 word, barely above a whisper, but clear and certain and absolutely real. It hit Eleanor in the chest like a physical thing. She crossed the porch in 2 steps and went to her knees in front of him and pulled him against her, without thinking about whether it was too fast or too much, or whether he'd pull back. He didn't pull back. He pressed his face against her shoulder, and she felt his small arms come up around her neck, and she held on with her eyes shut tight. She was crying. She hadn't noticed when that started. "Come on," she managed. "Let's get you inside. You're freezing." She picked him up, which he permitted, and carried him back through the door. She sat down in the rocking chair by the kitchen stove with him in her lap and wrapped a blanket over them both and held him until the shaking in her hands stopped. That was how Silas found them. He came in through the back door at 11:30, still cold from the ride, and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Eleanor looked up at him over Sammy's head, Sammy, who had fallen asleep against her shoulder, with his fist curled in the collar of her coat. Silas looked at his son, at Eleanor, at her red-rimmed eyes, at the rifle propped against the front wall, which he could see from where he stood. He went to the front door and looked out at the yard for a long moment. When he came back, he crouched down beside the rocking chair, so he was at eye level with Eleanor. "Wolves," he said quietly. "6, I got the alpha. The rest scattered. Riders," she looked at him steadily. "2. They left when I made my point." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. "Sammy," he said. "He came down during the shooting." He was frightened. She paused. He spoke Silas. Silas went very still. "1 word," she said. He said cold. He reached out and put his hand over Sammy's head, very gently, the way you touch something you've been afraid to believe in. He didn't say anything. He kept his hand there for a long moment. Then he stood up and went to the kitchen counter and stood with his back to her. And she could see the tension across his shoulders that came from not wanting anyone to watch what his face was doing just then. Eleanor looked down at the small dark head on her shoulder. Outside, the moon was still brilliant and high. The wolves were long gone. The cattle had quieted. The yard was exactly as it always was, silver and still. She rocked gently, once, and listened to Sammy breathe. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, reluctantly, in fits and starts, with cold snapping back hard every time it seemed like the worst was over. By March, the snow was pulling back from the south-facing slopes. The cattle that had made it through winter were thin but alive, and the calving season was starting in earnest. Eleanor had learned to read the signs of an imminent birth the way a cow separated herself from the herd. The restlessness, the particular look of an animal that had gone internal with effort. She could assist a difficult birth now without panicking, which was more than she could have said in December. Clara had, somewhere around February, stopped being a project Eleanor was managing and started being a person Eleanor actually knew. It happened in small degrees. Clara began asking Eleanor questions about Denver, not friendly questions exactly, more like a lawyer deposing a witness, wanting specific details, not impressions. What were the buildings like? How many people lived there? Was it true the restaurants had menus printed on paper and you could order anything you wanted? Eleanor answered all of it honestly, including the parts that weren't glamorous, and Clara listened with the focused attention she brought to everything. One evening, Eleanor found Clara at the kitchen table with Eleanor's old law notes spread out in front of her, reading carefully. "You can look at those," Eleanor said, "but ask me if you have questions. Some of the language is technical." Clara looked up. "What's a compounding clause?" Eleanor sat down across from her and explained it plainly, using the ranch's own loan as an example. Clara listened, asked 3 follow-up questions, all of them sharp. At the end, she said, "So Cross basically rewrote the contract after Dad signed it and hoped Dad wouldn't notice. That's what the evidence suggests. That's stealing." "Yes," Eleanor said, dressed up in legal language, "but yes." Clara looked at the documents for another moment. "Can you beat it?" "I think so, if we get in front of the right judge." Clara folded the documents carefully and put them back in their order. "Okay," she said, and went back to her school book. That was the end of the conversation. But that night, Clara set 2 cups on the table for after-supper coffee without being asked, one for Silas, one for Eleanor. Sammy was talking, not fluently, not in long sentences, not the way a 4-year-old who had never stopped would talk. He came out in words and short phrases, cautiously, as if he was testing each one before trusting it. He said hungry and hoarse and more and cold and occasionally no, with great firmness when something displeased him. He said Clara when his sister came into a room. He said Daddy when Silas picked him up. He had not yet said Eleanor's name. She didn't press it. She kept doing what she'd been doing, including him, talking to him, making space for him without requiring anything in return. It was a Tuesday in late March when Cross came. Eleanor was in the kitchen yard, hanging wash when she heard the horses. 3 riders coming in from the road. Good horses, well-fed, carrying men who were used to riding on other people's land as if they owned it. The man in the lead was maybe 50, lean and straight-backed with silver at his temples, and a coat that cost more than most men in the territory made in a month. Rode with the particular ease of someone who has never had serious cause to be nervous. She'd never seen Jedediah Cross before that moment, but she knew him. Silas was in the near barn. He came out when he heard the horses, wiping his hands on a cloth, and stopped when he saw who it was. Eleanor dried her hands on her apron and walked to where Silas was standing. Cross pulled up 10 feet from them and looked the place over with the slow, assessing gaze of a man calculating a purchase price. His 2 riders flanked him, one on each side. Eleanor recognized the rider on the right as the man whose hat she'd shot off in January. He was wearing a new hat. He didn't look at her. "Thorne," Cross said. He had a southern voice, smooth and measured. "You're looking thin. Hard winter. Winters are hard on everyone," Silas said. "Not everyone," Cross smiled. "I wanted to ride over personally, extend an offer. The banknotes come due in August. I think we both know you're not going to make them." He said it matter-of-factly, the way someone states the weather. "I'm willing to take the land at assessed value and let you walk away clean. No embarrassment, no foreclosure proceedings. A clean sale. I'm not selling." Cross looked at Eleanor for the first time. He took his time about it, looking her over with the same calculating expression he'd used on the land. "So this is the arrangement. I'd heard you'd taken on a wife." He paused deliberately. "Mail order, was it? Barren one at that, from what I understand. Couldn't hold a husband in Denver, so she ended up out here." The words landed exactly as they were intended to. Silas's right hand moved. It dropped to his side, fingers open, and it stopped there, hovering, about 4 inches from the colt on his hip. The yard went absolutely still. Cross saw the hand. His smile didn't change, but his eyes did a quick, sharp calculation, the look of a man who has gotten exactly what he was fishing for. Eleanor stepped forward. She moved to Silas's left side and stood there, shoulder level with his arm, and she looked up at Cross with the same expression she had used on Thomas Hayes's lawyers in a Denver courtroom when they tried the same tactic in a different costume. Silas glanced at her. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He reached down and took her hand. His fingers closed around hers, scarred palm against scarred palm, and he turned back to Cross. "She is not a hired hand," Silas said. His voice was even, unhurried. "She is my wife, my equal, and she holds half title to this land. So when you're making your calculations about Ironwood, you'd better account for both of us." Cross looked at their joined hands. Something shifted in his expression, not retreat, but recalibration. He was a man who understood power, and he'd just watched his intended wedge fail to divide anything. "The offer stands until August," Cross said. "Think carefully. Thorne, both of you." He pulled his horse around. His riders followed. They rode back out the way they'd come, and the sound of the hoofbeats faded down the road. Silas and Eleanor stood in the yard for a moment. He was still holding her hand. He seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. He released her and stepped back, not awkwardly, but with the careful movement of a man who has surprised himself. "You didn't have to step up like that," he said. "Yes, I did," Eleanor said. "And you know it." He looked at her for a moment, something in his face that was still figuring something out. Then he nodded once and went back to the barn. Eleanor went back to the wash. Her hands were steady. She noticed that, and was glad of it. That evening, she laid out everything she had on the Cross loan documents across the kitchen table. Silas sat across from her, and Martha brought coffee and sat down too, which she had not done before. And Clara pulled her chair around to see. "Here's where we are," Eleanor said. She'd been building toward this for weeks, and now she laid it out plainly. The way she'd learned to present information to a judge, no preamble, no apologies, just the facts in the right order. The compounding clause on the second note was added after signing. The ink is different, and the handwriting is Cross's clerk's, not the bank's. That makes the clause fraudulent, if we remove it. The amount owed drops by almost 40%. 40%, Silas said. 40%. That's still significant. But It's manageable if the spring cattle prices hold. She moved to the next page. However, the bigger issue isn't the loan amount. It's the water. Silas and Martha exchanged a look. The river bend, Silas said. Cross controls the river bend's upper section. He's been diverting flow to his own land during dry months for 2 years. That's why your south pasture has been short in late summer. She turned to face Silas directly, if he dams it fully, and he can. With what he currently holds, you lose the south pasture entirely. That's a third of your grazing land. He's threatened it before, Martha said. Never followed through, because until now he didn't need to, Eleanor said. He thought the loans alone would be enough to push Silas out. They weren't. So next step is the water. Clara had been listening to all of this with her chin in her hand. So what do we do? Eleanor looked at her. We look at the Desert Land Act. The what? Federal law, passed in 1877. It covers water rights in the Western Territories, specifically for ranching and irrigation. Eleanor pulled a handwritten summary from the bottom of the stack. She'd written it from memory, and from a legal text she'd borrowed from the circuit judge's modest library on her last trip to Decker's Crossing. The act is very specific about what you can and cannot do with shared water sources. You cannot dam a watercourse that serves existing agricultural operations without federal approval. Cross doesn't have that approval. What he's done with the small diversions is questionable. A full dam would be a federal violation. Plain and clear. Silas leaned forward. Can you prove it? I need 2 things. The original land survey from when Ironwood was filed, which shows the riverbend as a shared water source, and a witness to the diversion, someone who saw Cross's men working on the upper section. Cole saw them, Silas said, his neighbor, the man he'd been helping in January. He mentioned it last fall. I didn't think much of it at the time. Would he swear to it in front of a federal marshal? Silas thought about that. Yes, Eleanor nodded. Then we have a case. It won't be fast. These things never are. But it's solid, and it's real, and it's the kind of thing that doesn't just stop Cross, it exposes him. She looked around the table. He's been doing this to multiple ranches. If we bring a federal complaint, the other ranchers can attach to it. This doesn't have to be just Ironwood's fight. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Martha refilled the coffee cups. You've been planning this since January, Silas said. It wasn't an accusation, just recognition. I've been working on it since the first morning I read your ledger, Eleanor said. He looked at her with that expression again. The one she was beginning to understand was Silas Thorne, deciding something, quietly and completely, in a way that didn't require announcement. All right, he said. Tell us what we need to do, she told them, and they listened, all 3 of them, until the lamp burned low and the fire settled into coals, and the Wyoming night pressed cold and patient against the windows. Cross didn't know it yet, but the tide had started turning. April arrived and Cross made his move. Eleanor was riding back from Decker's Crossing with the land survey documents. She'd spent 3 hours in the county records office, going through rolled maps and filed claims and the cramped handwriting of territorial surveyors when she came up over the South Ridge and stopped her horse. The river bend below her was barely moving. She sat in the saddle and looked at it for a long moment. 2 weeks ago, that section ran clear and steady, winter melt keeping it full. Now it was a thin thread, picking its way through a widened, muddy bed. She could see the waterline marks on the rocks where it had been, and where it was now. She turned her horse and rode hard back to the ranch. Silas was in the south pasture with Pete, checking on the cattle when she found him. She pulled up and told him what she'd seen. He rode to the ridge himself and looked for a long time without saying anything. He did it, Silas said. Yes, the cattle can't sustain on what's left, not through summer. He pulled his horse around. I'm going up there, Silas. His jaw was set, and his eyes had gone flat and still, and Eleanor had learned by now what that meant. It meant he had moved past considering options and had arrived at a single course of action. And that course of action involved DeCrox's upper dam with a rifle and a 4-year accumulation of fury. Listen to me, she said. He's killing my ranch. Eleanor, Listen anyway. She moved her horse in front of his. If you ride up there with a gun, he wins. He has 6 hired men and the county sheriff in his pocket. And if he can provoke you into firing first, everything we've built legally goes away. You hand him exactly what he wants. Silas looked at her. He wants you angry, Eleanor said. He's been engineering this since the beginning. The loans, the harassment, the wolves in January, none of it worked. So now he's taken the water because he knows you'll come at him, and he's ready for that. A dead rancher's land transfers even easier than a foreclosed one. The words landed. Silas's hand was still resting on his rifle stock. He didn't move it for a long moment. We have the case, Eleanor said. I have the survey. It clearly marks the river bend as a shared waterway, serving both Ironwood and 3 other ranches. Cross-building a dam on a federally designated shared waterway is a criminal violation of the Desert Land Act, not a civil dispute. That means federal marshals, not the county sheriff. How long does that take? If we ride to Cheyenne and file in person, we can have a federal marshal out here within 2 weeks. The cattle don't have 2 weeks. I know. She had been working on this part. Cole's Riverbend access is being cut too. He mentioned it last week. And the Bower Ranch farther east. If all 3 of us file a joint emergency petition citing imminent agricultural damage, a federal judge can issue a temporary injunction ordering Cross to remove the dam within 72 hours of service. He doesn't comply. He's in contempt of a federal court. Silas stared at her. You know how to file a federal injunction. I watched one get filed in Denver. I know the form and the language. She paused. I've already drafted it. It's in the kitchen desk. He looked at her for a long moment. The anger was still there in his face, but it was changing shape from the blunt force of a man who sees one option to the harder, more controlled intensity of a man who sees a better one. You drafted it before you even knew he'd built the dam, Silas said. I drafted it when I realized he was going to. It was the logical next move. He was quiet. The south pasture stretched below them, the cattle moving slowly, the thin thread of the river bend catching April light. What about the fraudulent loan clause? He said. We attach it to the same filing. Federal jurisdiction covers both issues if we frame the loan fraud as part of a coordinated scheme to illegally acquire land, which it is. Eleanor straightened in the saddle. Cross thinks he's been running a careful operation. He's actually been building us a case for 2 years. Silas exhaled slowly. He took his hand off the rifle stock. When do we ride? Tomorrow morning. I want Cole and Bower with us, if possible. Their testimony strengthens the joint filing. Can you reach them today? Cole, yes. Bower is farther, but I can send Pete. Do that. She turned her horse. I'll have everything ready tonight. They rode back to the ranch together, and she spent that evening at the kitchen table with the lamp burning, and every document spread out around her, the land survey, the original loan papers, her notes on the Desert Land Act, the draft injunction, Cole's previous statement about witnessing the diversion work. She organized it into a sequence that told a clear story. A judge would need to understand it quickly. Judges were busy people. Clara sat with her for 2 hours that evening without being asked. She sharpened Eleanor's pencils when they wore down and held documents flat when the draft from the window, kept lifting them and didn't speak unless Eleanor spoke to her. Around 9 o'clock, she said, if this works, will Cross go to prison? That depends on how the federal prosecutor decides to proceed, Eleanor said. He could face criminal charges for the loan fraud and the Dam Act violation. At minimum, he loses the water rights and the fraudulent loan terms get voided. The other ranches he squeezed might have grounds to file their own suits. So it might actually hurt him. It will absolutely hurt him. The question is how much. Clara was quiet for a moment. He said those things about you. In the yard. Yes, that wasn't just rude. That was on purpose. To make Dad lose his temper. Eleanor looked at her. 11 years old. And she'd read the whole sequence exactly right. Yes, Eleanor said. Exactly right. Clara nodded, satisfied, and went back to holding the survey flat. They rode to Decker's Crossing the next morning, Silas and Eleanor and Cole, whose broad red face was so angry about the water diversion that he hadn't stopped talking for the first 3 miles. At the telegraph office, Eleanor sent a wire ahead to the Federal District Court in Cheyenne so the clerk would expect their filing. At the land office, she had the survey officially certified. At the notary, she had Cole's witness statement sworn and stamped. It took most of the day. They ate a late lunch at the Crossings One restaurant, a dim, low-ceilinged place that smelled like gravy and wood smoke, and went over the documents one final time. The restaurant's owner, a woman named Vera, who had been feeding Decker's Crossing for 20 years, brought extra coffee without being asked and lingered near the table long enough to overhear the nature of the discussion. As she refilled Cole's cup, she said, quietly to Eleanor, "The Quincy Ranch sold to Cross in February. Charlie Quincy told my husband Cross's men showed up and walked the fence line 3 days in a row before Charlie got the message. If you're building a case, Charlie might talk." Eleanor looked up at her. "Thank you." Vera refilled the cups and went back to her kitchen. Cole looked at Eleanor. "You want to ride by the Quincy place on the way back?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I do." Charlie Quincy was a tired man in his 60s who had sold his ranch for half what it was worth because Cross's systematic pressure had broken him. He sat in the kitchen of the small house he'd rented in Decker's Crossing and listened to Eleanor lay out the case for 45 minutes. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" "A sworn statement," Eleanor said, describing the specific tactics Cross used. The fence walking, the verbal threats, the date the bank called your note. She paused. "It won't undo the sale, but it helps establish the pattern. And pattern evidence is what turns a water rights case into a land fraud case." He signed the statement. They rode back to Ironwood in the early evening, with the sun going orange and flat across the plains, and a complete federal filing package in Eleanor's saddlebag. Silas rode beside her and didn't say much for the first few miles. Then he said, "You went to see Quincy even before we knew he'd talk. I went to see if he would. What if he hadn't? Then we still had the core case." She looked at the road ahead. "But people who've been wronged usually want to say so. They just need to believe it matters." Silas was quiet again for a while. "You're good at this." Eleanor glanced at him. "The law," he said, thinking it through, building it. He paused. "You should have been an attorney. Women can't be admitted to the bar in Wyoming Territory." Eleanor said, "I checked." Silas looked at her. "You checked." "I checked when I was fighting Thomas's estate. I wanted to represent myself." She kept her voice even. "The judge told me I was welcome to observe." She could feel Silas working through his opinion of that. "That'll change," he said finally. "Has to." "Probably," Eleanor said. "In the meantime, we work with what we have." They filed in Cheyenne 4 days later. The federal clerk took the packet, reviewed it, and told them without expression that it was one of the more comprehensively prepared emergency filings he had processed that year. Eleanor thanked him without showing how much that cost her to keep her face still about. The injunction issued in 6 days. Cross had 72 hours to remove the dam. He didn't remove it. Federal contempt proceedings were filed on the 73rd day, and Silas, who had been patient through all of it in a way that had clearly cost him considerably, rode up to the ridge above the river bend on the 74th day and looked at the dam still sitting there, and came home and said to Eleanor, very quietly, that he thought it was time to discuss their contingency plan. Eleanor had been expecting this conversation. "The dam has to come down," she said. "The legal process will get there, but the cattle don't have weeks." "No," she nodded. She unfolded the map she'd been working on for 3 days, a topographical sketch of the River Bend Canyon. Cross's dam site, the access routes in and out. Silas looked at it. He looked at Eleanor. "You made this," he said. "I measured what I could from the ridge. I estimated the rest from the survey." She put her finger on the map. "You worked explosives for the Union Pacific for 4 years. 6, he said. "Tell me what you'd need." He pulled the map closer and studied it for a long moment. "Access from the East Canyon wall is better than the road. Cross keeps men on the road, not the canyon. The dam structure itself, from what I could see, it's a timber crib dam. Fill and rock face. The weak point is here." He put his own finger on the sketch. precisely where she'd marked a question. Eleanor looked at where his finger was, looked at where her question mark was. They were the same spot. She looked up at him. He was looking at the map with the focused, calculating expression of a man in his element. She had seen him uncertain, exhausted, quietly desperate. This was different. This was Silas Thorne doing the thing he actually knew how to do. "How much lead time do we need?" she said. "If I can get up the east wall without being seen, 2 hours to wire it. 30 minutes to get clear." He looked at her. "I'm not doing this without cover. Cross will have men." "I know," Eleanor said. "I'll take the high ground." He looked at her steadily. "You understand what we're doing. We're destroying illegal property in active contempt of a federal court order," Eleanor said, "by any reasonable legal interpretation. We're assisting in the enforcement of an injunction Cross refused to comply with. That's one way to frame it. It's the accurate frame. And when the marshal arrives the next day, as he's scheduled to, we will have documentary evidence of Cross's contempt and a dam that is no longer obstructing federally designated water flow." She paused. "Our case gets stronger, not weaker." Silas looked at her for a long moment. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They sat across the kitchen table from each other, with the map between them, and planned it out, detail by detail, until the lamp burned low. Outside, the April night was cold and clear, the sky enormous above the Wyoming plain. Eleanor was not afraid. She thought she probably should be. But when she examined what she actually felt, sitting in this kitchen, in this house, with this man across the table from her, it was something considerably different from fear. She pulled her notes closer and kept working. The night before the raid, neither of them slept much. Eleanor lay in her narrow bed and listened to the ranch settle around her. The familiar sounds, the horses in the barn, the wind moving along the eaves, the occasional low sound of cattle from the south pasture. Sounds she hadn't known 3 months ago and now could read like language. She got up at midnight and went down to the kitchen. Silas was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the topographical map, not studying it. He'd memorized it 2 days ago, just having something to do with his hands. He looked up when she came in. She went to the stove and poured a cup and sat down across from him. They sat in the quiet for a while. The fire popped. The clock on the shelf marked the minutes. "Tell me about the railroad work," she said. He looked at her. "You've never talked about it," she said. "I'd like to know." He was quiet for a moment, turning the cup in his hands. Then he said, "I was 22 when I started. Union Pacific was pushing west through the Rockies. The surveyors would pick a route, and then the blasters came in to make it possible." He paused. "You'd look at a solid rock face and have to figure out where it was weak, where the fault lines ran, how much force was needed to move it without bringing the wrong thing down." He looked at the map. "It's the same calculation as anything else. You're not fighting the rock. You're finding where it already wants to break." Eleanor listened. He didn't talk often, and when he did, it was worth paying attention to. "Were you good at it?" "I was careful," he said. "That's most of what good means in that work." He took a drink of coffee. "A man named Garrett taught me. 15 years on the railroad," he said. "The worst blasters are the ones who are impatient. They use too much because they don't want to take the time to find the exact point." He set the cup down. "Garrett said, you use only what's necessary. No more. Clean work leaves clean results." Eleanor thought about that. "Is that how you think about everything?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The ranch, the children, the whole situation." She gestured vaguely. "You're not a man who overreacts. I almost drew on Cross. Almost, but you didn't." He was quiet. "I used to," he said, "when I was younger. Before Anna." He said his wife's name without flinching, which Eleanor noticed because she knew it hadn't always been that way. Anna was the patient one. She'd watch something develop over weeks and then tell me exactly what it was going to do next, like she could see around corners. He paused. "I couldn't see around corners. I just tried to be strong enough to handle whatever came." "That's not nothing," Eleanor said. "No, but it's not enough on its own." The fire shifted. Eleanor turned her cup in her hands. "Tell me about your husband," Silas said. She'd known it would come up eventually. Fair exchange, she supposed. Thomas was a decent man, she said, genuinely, not cruel, not unkind. But he was weak in the specific way that manifests as cruelty eventually. He could never stand up to his mother, and so everything she wanted from him, she got, including the will. She paused. I spent 4 years in that house, trying to be what Margaret Hayes wanted, more agreeable, less opinionated. I gave up practicing the law I'd taught myself because she thought it was unseemly. She looked at the table. When Thomas died, I realized I had made myself smaller for 4 years and still ended up with nothing. Silas was listening with the particular quality of attention that she'd come to associate with him, completely present, not formulating a response while she was still talking. She called you Baron, he said. It was flat, not a question, in front of witnesses. As a final word, Eleanor looked up. I don't know if it's true. I was never with child during 4 years of marriage. But that could mean many things medically. She kept her voice steady. What I know is that she said it as if it were a verdict, as if the whole value of a woman could be determined by one fact. That's ignorance, Silas said, speaking plain. Yes, Eleanor looked at him. But ignorance that gets spoken out loud long enough starts to sound like truth. I had begun to believe it. Do you still? She thought about it honestly. Some days, less than I did. He reached across the table and picked up her right hand, her scarred hand, the one that had taken the worst of the barbed wire in January, the one that still had a thin pink line across the palm. He held it in both of his, not doing anything with it, just holding it. She let him. You saved that calf, he said. You saved Sammy. You have taken apart a man's legal scheme piece by piece and built a federal case in a kitchen in Wyoming territory with borrowed books and paper and pure stubbornness. He looked at her hand, at the scar. Tell me what's missing. Eleanor looked at him. He wasn't performing comfort. He was stating what he could observe, the way he'd described reading a rock face, looking for where things already were, not where you wished them to be. There was something in that which she found harder to deflect than sympathy would have been. I don't know how to do this, she said, meaning something more specific than the ranch or the legal case. Neither do I, Silas said. I haven't since Anna. He was still holding her hand. Outside, the Wyoming night was enormous and silent. In the rooms above them, their children were sleeping. Not a thought she'd had before. Their children. But it arrived without warning, and it was accurate, and she didn't push it away. Clara likes you, Silas said. Eleanor almost smiled. Clara tolerates me. That's significant progress. You don't know Clara, what she does when she likes someone. He looked at the ceiling, toward the upstairs. She sharpened every pencil in the house when you were working on the legal documents. She reorganized the firewood so you'd have a clear path to the stove in the morning. He paused. She's been watching the South Ridge every evening to make sure Cross's men aren't back. Eleanor was quiet. She doesn't know how to be easy with people, Silas said. She learned to protect herself too young, but she shows what she means through what she does. He looked at Eleanor. I think you understand that. She did, more than he probably knew. Sammy will say your name, Silas said, when he's ready. He does things when he's ready. I know, Eleanor said. I'm not waiting for it. I know you're not. That's why he'll do it. He paused. The things you said about making yourself smaller, not being seen as who you are. He stopped, seeming to choose his words carefully. I see you, Eleanor. I want you to know that. However tonight goes, and whatever comes after. She looked at him across the table in the lamplight. This man she had known for 3 months. This man who had pulled her out of a blizzard and handed her his coat and offered her something real when everything else had been taken from her. She turned her hand over in his and held on. He leaned across the table and kissed her. Quiet, careful, certain, the way you move, when you know exactly what you're doing, and you've been thinking about it for longer than you've admitted. She kissed him back. When they pulled apart, the lamp was burning low, and the fire had gone to coals. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Silas said, My room is larger. The bed is better. Eleanor laughed. Actually laughed, which surprised her. That is the least romantic sentence ever spoken, she said. He looked at her with something that was almost a smile. I'm a practical man. You are, she said. I know. She stood up. He stood up. She took the lamp. She led the way up the stairs, and he followed. And the house held them quietly in its walls, the way a good house holds the people inside it, without comment, without judgment, just warmly and completely. In the morning, before the sun was up, they rose and made coffee and spread the map on the table and went over the plan one final time. Their hands touched over the paper. They left them that way. Outside, the sky was going pale at the eastern edge. That particular gray-pink that comes before the sun commits. The river bend was out there somewhere, dammed and thin, waiting. The canyon was waiting. Cross was waiting, though he didn't know for what. Silas poured 2 cups, and they stood at the kitchen window together, looking out at the coming day. And Eleanor thought that whatever was waiting out there in the canyon could wait a little longer. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. They left before dawn. Martha knew. Eleanor hadn't told her directly. But Martha was not a woman who missed things happening in her own house. And when she came down at 4 in the morning and found them both dressed in dark clothes with the map spread on the table, and Silas checking the dynamite caps with the careful hands of a man who has done it 1,000 times. She simply went to the stove and made a large pot of coffee and a quantity of biscuits and put them on the table without a word. Silas looked up at her. Eat before you go, Martha said. Both of you. They ate. Clara appeared at the bottom of the stairs at 4:30. She was fully dressed, which meant she hadn't slept either. I want to come, she said. No, Silas said. I can ride and I can Clara. His voice was quiet. I need you here. Sammy wakes up scared when the house is empty. I need someone he trusts. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Eleanor. Eleanor said, We'll be back by noon. Clara held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she went and sat at the table and took a biscuit and didn't say anything else. But as Eleanor pulled on her coat and lifted her Winchester from the rack, Clara said without looking up, The East Canyon wall has loose shale about halfway up. Stay on the rock shelf if you can. Eleanor looked at her. I rode up there last summer, Clara said, still not looking up. Before Cross put his men on the road. Silas looked at his daughter with an expression Eleanor recognized pride, too large to fit into the moment. So it just sat there on his face, barely contained. Thank you, Eleanor said. Clara picked at her biscuit. Just come back. They rode out into the dark. Silas on his big roan and Eleanor on the bay mare she'd been riding since February. The mare who had an easy canter and more sense than most horses Eleanor had encountered. The dynamite was wrapped in oilcloth in Silas's saddlebag. Eleanor's Winchester was across her saddle. The sky to the east was not yet light, just a faint loosening of the dark, the stars beginning to recede. Cole and his 2 ranch hands were waiting at the junction of the Ironwood Road and the old survey track. Cole looked like a man who had been angry for several months and was finally getting to do something about it. His hands were younger, late 20s, with the solid look of men accustomed to difficult work. They nodded at Eleanor without any of the hesitation she'd encountered from men in the early months. She had shot a wolf at 100 yards in the dark. Reputation, it turned out. Traveled, Silas laid out the plan one final time at the junction, keeping his voice low, drawing in the dirt with a stick, where the light from a single shielded lantern let him. Cole, your men hold the road approach from the south. Cross has 2 men stationed there. They change at 6. We move before the change. When they're tired and thinking about breakfast, he drew the canyon approach. I go up the east wall to the dam site. Eleanor takes the high ridge above the canyon mouth. If Cross has anyone in the canyon itself, which is possible, she has line of sight on the whole floor. Cole looked at Eleanor. You comfortable on that ridge in the dark? I'll be in position before first light, Eleanor said. I'll have 20 minutes of visibility before anyone in the canyon can see me against the sky. Cole nodded. He had stopped questioning Eleanor's assessments sometime around the federal filing. She'd earned that. They split at the canyon approach. Cole's men melted into the brush south of the road. Silas and Eleanor rode east, picking their way along the base of the canyon wall until they found the shelf Clara had described, a natural ledge of solid rock running upward at an angle, wide enough for a horse in most places, narrow enough to require attention. They tied the horses at the base. Eleanor went up first, rifle over her shoulder, moving in the dark by feel and memory of the map. The shale section Clara had warned her about was exactly where she'd said. She tested each step, kept her weight on the back foot, moved slowly. The shelf widened above it, and the going got easier. She reached the ridge as the sky went from black to deep blue. The canyon floor spread below her, still in shadow. She could see the dam from here, a solid timber and rock structure spanning the canyon's narrow neck, maybe 40 feet across. The river bend ran against its face, backed up into a shallow lake on Cross's side. And on the downstream side, the riverbed was dry stone and cracked mud. She could see two men at the base of the dam, Cross's guards, warming their hands over a small fire, their attention on the road approach, not the canyon walls. She settled into position on the ridge, rifle across her knees, and waited. Below and to her right, she could hear nothing, which meant Silas was moving well. The sky got lighter in small degrees, blue to gray, to the first thin edge of gold on the peaks above. At the dam, one of the guards stood and stretched and said something to the other. His voice carried faintly up the canyon walls, but the words dissolved before they reached her. She tracked him through the rifle's sight for a moment, then let the barrel drop. She was here to keep them occupied and away from Silas, not to shoot anyone who didn't make it necessary. She waited. At 6:10 by the sun's position, she heard it, the sound of movement below the dam on the east side, very faint, the particular care of a man placing himself precisely. She didn't look toward it. She kept her eyes on the two guards. The guards heard something, too. A moment later, the nearer one turned toward the east wall. Squinting, Eleanor put a round into the rock face 6 feet to his left. The crack of the shot rolled through the canyon like thunder. Both guards dove. The near one scrambled behind the dam's edge. The far one dropped flat and started working toward cover, moving away from the east wall. Good, away from Silas. She worked the lever and held position. From the south end of the canyon came the sound of shouting. Cole's diversion was in play. She could hear hoofbeats on the road approach and the flat report of a rifle. 2 shots. A pause. A third. Cole was keeping Cross's road detail occupied. Movement at the canyon rim opposite her. A third man, one she hadn't seen, who had been positioned above the dam on the west wall. He'd spotted her position. She saw the barrel of his rifle come up. She moved 2 steps left along the ridge, not far, but enough, and his shot hit where she'd been. She returned fire. She wasn't trying to hit him. She was trying to make him keep his head down, and she succeeded. He dropped behind the rim, below at the dam. She could now see Silas. He was moving along the base of the east wall with the focused efficiency of a man following an internal map. He had the first charge set before she'd processed that he'd reached the dam. His hands moved with precision, no wasted motion, no hesitation. The way he'd described Garrett's teaching. Use only what's necessary. Find where it already wants to break. He placed the second charge at a point 12 feet from the first, at the corner where the timber crib met the canyon wall. That was the weak point. That was where the structure's weight transferred to the rock, and where the rock, according to Silas's calculations, had been undermined by the backed-up water. The near guard came back around the dam's edge with his rifle up. Eleanor's shot hit the dam timber 4 inches from his hand. He went back behind cover. She heard him yelling to the man on the west rim, who answered, and they were triangulating, trying to figure out how many shooters were on the east ridge. She fired twice more in quick succession at different angles, letting them work on that problem. Silas set the third charge. He ran the wire back along the canyon wall with the long, ground-eating stride of a tall man who was moving fast, but not panicking. He needed distance. The blast radius from that quantity of explosives in a narrow canyon was not something you wanted to guess about. He reached the base of the east wall and pressed flat against the rock. He looked up at Eleanor. She could see him clearly. Now the light was good, the canyon brightening fast. He held up one hand, then pointed south. She fired 3 times into the canyon floor, fast, creating noise and dust and confusion. At the south end, Cole's men answered with a volley that rattled off the canyon walls. Silas touched the wire to the battery. The explosion did not sound like one thing. It sounded like the canyon itself deciding to rearrange. The first charge hit, and the sound went outward in a wave, bouncing from wall to wall. The second charge, a half-second behind, took the corner of the structure where the weight concentrated. Eleanor felt the concussion in her chest from 200 feet up on the ridge. The third charge went a second after that. The dam moved. It moved the way Silas had said it would, not outward in one dramatic piece, but inward and downward, collapsing along the line of least resistance where the underpinning had been weakened. The timber and rock face dropped. The backed-up lake surged forward through the gap, and the sound of it was enormous, not an explosion sound, but a natural sound. The deep roar of water, finding its way home. The river bend came down the canyon in a white rush. Eleanor stood on the ridge and watched it go. She'd seen the thin, struggling thread of it on the ride from Decker's Crossing 3 weeks ago, and here it was now full and fast and furious, pouring through the canyon and down toward the south pasture, and the parched cattle and the cracked earth that had been waiting for it. The guards were gone. She could see them at the road end of the canyon, running their horses, already moving. Cole's men had held the road. The sound of gunfire from the south had stopped. She looked down at the east wall base. Silas was standing in the canyon, the blast wire still in his hand, watching the water go past, with an expression she could read from the ridge, even at that distance. His hat was off. His hair was windblown. He was watching his ranch come back to life. Eleanor put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled, sharp and carrying. He looked up. She raised her rifle over her head. He raised one arm back. She picked her way down the canyon walls slowly, because the shale section was worse going down than up, and she had no interest in a broken ankle on the morning of her first successful dam demolition. She reached the valley floor as Silas came around the canyon mouth, and they met on the bank of the river bend. The water was running clear and fast and cold at their feet. "Clean work," Eleanor said. He looked at her, and then he laughed. She'd heard him laugh before, but not like this, not with his whole chest in it. The sound carrying up the canyon walls and dissolving into the open Wyoming sky. Cole came riding up from the south at a canter, his face flushed, roads clear, his men scattered. He pulled up at the bank and looked at the running water for a long moment. "God in heaven," he said quietly. The water ran on past them, south and east, toward 3 ranches that had been dying without it. Eleanor thought of Clara, watching the south ridge from the kitchen window. "Let's go home," she said. Cross didn't run immediately. That was the one thing Eleanor hadn't predicted with certainty. She had built the legal case on the assumption that a man in Cross's position, facing federal contempt charges and the destruction of his primary leverage, would cut his losses and lawyer up. She had been prepared for that. She had contingency documents for that. What she hadn't built a contingency for was a man who, stripped of every advantage, stopped being calculating and became something simpler and more dangerous. The federal marshal arrived on schedule, a lean, careful man named Aldrich from Cheyenne, who read Eleanor's complete filing package on Silas's porch in 45 minutes without changing his expression once. He asked 4 questions, all of them precise. He thanked Eleanor and Silas, rode to Cross Star Ranch, and issued the arrest warrant. Cross wasn't there. His housekeeper said he'd ridden out that morning with 2 men and hadn't said where. Marshal Aldrich came back to Ironwood that evening and sat at Eleanor's kitchen table. She noticed he had begun thinking of it as Eleanor's kitchen table, which was accurate, and said that Cross had also cleaned out his office safe before leaving. The land deeds, the loan contracts, the cash reserves, gone. "He's running," Silas said. "Possibly," Aldrich said. "Or he's preparing for something." He looked at Eleanor. "Is there anything he might want to destroy before he goes?" "Documents, evidence relevant to your case." Eleanor thought about it. "He'd want the original land survey. the one that establishes the river bend as shared water. Without it, our case is still solid, but the dam violation is harder to prove definitively. She paused. I have certified copies. The originals are in the county records office in Decker's Crossing. I'll ride to Decker's Crossing tonight, Aldrich said. Take the North Road, Silas said. Faster. Aldrich left. Silas rode a circuit of the property, checking the fence lines, making sure the hands were posted. Eleanor sat with the children through supper and afterward, and they were quiet. The particular quiet of people who understand that something is still in motion and hasn't finished yet. Sammy ate his supper and lined up his horses on the table's edge and looked at Eleanor with his serious eyes. Where, Daddy? He said. 3 words, strung together with intention. Eleanor set down her fork. He's checking the fences, she said. He'll be back soon. Sammy looked at the door for a moment. Then he looked back at Eleanor. Okay, he said, and went back to his horses. Clara, across the table, had gone very still. She was looking at her brother with an expression Eleanor had never seen on her face before, raw and open, years of worry suddenly visible all at once. She reached across and straightened one of Sammy's horses that had fallen over. That one's the troublemaker, Clara said to him, her voice carefully steady. Always falling down. Sammy picked it up and examined it with great seriousness. Troublemaker, he repeated, trying the word. That's right, Clara said. Eleanor picked up her fork and finished her supper and did not say anything, because some moments don't need anyone to say anything about them. Silas came in at 9. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Eleanor, who looked back, and something passed between them that had gotten easier since the night before the raid, the particular ease of people who have stopped performing caution for each other. Anything, she said. Nothing moving. Pete's on the north approach. Cole's man is on the road. He pulled off his coat and hat. Aldrich make it out all right. Left an hour ago. He sat down, and Martha put a plate in front of him, and he ate. Clara took Sammy up to bed. Martha went to her room. The house settled into its nighttime sounds. Eleanor was banking the kitchen fire when Silas said, quietly, he's going to do something. She stopped. He's not a man who accepts losing, Silas said. I've known men like him. When they can't win, they try to take something with them. Punish someone. Make sure it costs you, even when they're gone. He paused. He knows what hurts me most. Eleanor looked at him. Clara, she said. Silas nodded once. They looked at each other across the kitchen. How would he know she's Eleanor started? He's been watching this ranch for 2 years. He knows everything about it. Silas pushed back from the table. I'm going to ride a perimeter. I'll come. Stay with the children. She wanted to argue. She read his face and didn't. He was right. Someone needed to be in this house, and she was the better shot at close range, and Cross knew it, which meant if he was going to make a move indoors, he'd want her out of the way first. She went upstairs and checked on Clara asleep and Sammy, also asleep, his carved horses arranged in a row on the windowsill. She went to her own room and sat on the edge of the bed with the Winchester across her knees and listened to the house. An hour passed. 2. She heard the horse at 11:30. 1 horse, moving fast, coming from the north, which was wrong because Silas had ridden south. She was at the window in 4 steps. The moonlight was strong enough she could see the yard, the road approach. The barn a rider came through the gate at a run. Silas's roan, but the figure in the saddle was too slight. Eleanor was down the stairs and out the front door before the rider pulled up. It was Pete, old Pete, the ranch hand with the bad knee, who was supposed to be on the north approach. He was bleeding from a cut above his eye, and his hat was gone, and his face was the color of old ash. They took her, he said. He could barely get the words out. Miss Clara came from the east on foot, 2 of them, while I was watching north. I heard her yell and rode back, but they were all ready. They had horses waiting at the creek bed. He stopped. I'm sorry. I couldn't. Which direction? Eleanor said, west. Up the riverbend canyon. Back to the dam site, or what was left of it. She understood it immediately. Cross was drawing them back to ground, he knew. Ground that was now open and scarred from the explosion. Where the approach was controlled, and a man with 2 hired guns could hold a position against a larger force. He didn't want to escape. He wanted a standoff. He wanted to take something from Silas, the way he believed Silas had taken something from him. Eleanor went back inside for her rifle and her coat, and Silas's extra ammunition from the box in the hall. She fired 1 shot from the porch, the signal they'd agreed on. 3 minutes later, she heard Silas's horse coming from the south at full gallop. He came through the gate, and she told him in 10 seconds. He listened without interrupting. His face went through something she couldn't look directly at, the specific terror of a parent who hears their child is in danger. And then it went hard and still, and he was already turning his horse. "I know a way into the canyon that doesn't come from the road or the ridge," he said. "There's a dry wash on the north side. Feeds into the canyon floor about 100 yards below where the dam was. Comes out behind Cross's likely position. He'll expect the road and the ridge," Eleanor said. "He knows I took the ridge last time." "Exactly," Silas looked at her. "I take the wash. You take the ridge. He'll be watching the ridge, waiting for you, and I come up behind him. If he hears you in the wash, he won't." He said it without arrogance, just certainty. Eleanor looked at him. If Clara is in the open when things start, she'll know to get flat and stay flat. She's been taught that. He looked at Eleanor squarely. "You don't shoot unless you have a clean line. If Cross is between you and Clara, you don't shoot." "I know that," Eleanor said. "I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." He reined his horse toward the canyon road. "Give me 20 minutes to get through the wash. Then take the ridge." He rode. Eleanor mounted her mare and followed to the canyon approach, then split south to circle around to the east wall base. She tied the mare in the same spot as before and went up the wall in the dark, moving more carefully than she had at dawn because the moon was lower and the shadows were deeper, and she was running on 2 days of little sleep and the particular sharp focus that comes when something real is at stake. She reached the ridge. The canyon below was lit by moonlight and shadow. At the downstream end of where the dam had been, she could see the shapes of men, 2 standing, 1 mounted. The mounted man was Cross. She could tell by the coat, the horse, the posture. And there, sitting on a piece of dam timber at the canyon edge, with her arms behind her back, was Clara. Eleanor lay flat on the ridge and moved the rifle into position with the careful patience she had learned from watching Silas move, from watching how careful people work. She could not shoot from here. Cross was 10 feet from Clara, one of his men directly between them from this angle. She needed Cross to move, or she needed Silas in position to draw the men's attention. She waited. 15 minutes. 20. Cross was talking. She could hear his voice from the ridge. Not words, but tone measured, deliberate. The voice of a man who believes he is still in control of something. She watched Clara. The girl was sitting very straight, not moving, not reacting visibly. 11 years old and utterly composed. Eleanor felt something swell in her chest that had nothing to do with strategy. At the 22-minute mark, from the north end of the canyon, there was a sound. Not loud, a small displacement of rock. The sound a boot makes on loose stone, amplified by canyon walls. It was enough. Cross's head came up. He turned his horse north, and Silas walked out of the shadows at the canyon's north end with his rifle, reined his voice carrying off the walls, like the canyon itself was speaking. "It's over. Cross," he said. "Federal Marshal is 20 miles east and riding. Put the gun down." Cross pulled a revolver. Eleanor had the line she'd been waiting for. She fired once. The revolver went out of Cross's hand. He screamed, not hit. The shot had clipped the cylinder, and the force had wrenched it free. But it was gone, and his hand was shaking badly, and he was staring at it. The 2 hired men looked at the ridge. They looked at Silas. They looked at each other. One of them put his rifle on the ground, slowly, and stepped back from it. The other followed, a half-second behind. Men who are paid for intimidation rarely have much taste for situations that have gone this wrong. Cross wheeled his horse. He was still going to run. Eleanor could see it in the horse's motion, in the angle of Cross's body. He was going to leave his men and leave Clara and run for whatever he'd loaded in that safe and get out of Wyoming entirely. He made it 30 yards toward the canyon road before Silas's roan cut him off. Silas had moved faster than Eleanor had tracked, around the far side, while Cross was focused on the ridge, and now he was between Cross and the road exit, and his rifle was up and steady. Cross pulled his horse to a stop. They faced each other in the moonlit canyon. The man who had spent 3 years picking smaller men apart, and the rancher who had refused to fall. Silas rode forward until he was close enough that there was no possible mistake about his intention. Cross was a big man, but he had nothing left to work with. No hired guns, no legal maneuver, no leverage. He looked the way a man looks when everything he's built from calculation and cruelty finally reaches its arithmetic conclusion. Silas reached out and took Cross's horse by the bridle. He held it there for a moment. Then he let the rifle hang from his hand. "Get down," he said. Cross got down. Eleanor was off the ridge and on the canyon floor by then, moving toward Clara. She cut the rope on Clara's wrists, her own pocket knife, which she'd started carrying in October. And Clara stood up and turned around and did the thing Eleanor had never once seen her do. She put her arms around Eleanor's waist and held on. Eleanor held her back hard. "You're all right," Eleanor said. "You're all right." Clara didn't say anything for a moment. She was shaking, which she would probably be angry about later. And she pressed her face against Eleanor's shoulder and breathed. "I knew you'd come," she said. Her voice was muffled by Eleanor's coat. "Of course we came," Eleanor said. Behind them, Silas had Cross on the ground with a rope around his wrists, and the 2 hired men were sitting against the canyon wall, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. Silas came up beside Eleanor and put his hand on Clara's back. Clara reached up without letting go of Eleanor and grabbed a fistful of her father's shirt, pulling them both in. And Silas wrapped his other arm around his daughter and looked at Eleanor over Clara's head, with everything he could not say in front of the whole canyon and the moon. She looked back at him. She understood. Marshal Aldrich arrived at 6 in the morning, which was significantly faster than his estimated timeline, because he had encountered Cole on the Deckers Crossing Road, and Cole had informed him, with considerable energy, that things had developed overnight. Aldrich came with 2 deputies and a deputy's patience for paperwork. Eleanor gave him Cross's bound wrists and a complete narrative statement and the copies of every relevant document, organized in the same sequence she'd used for the federal filing. Aldrich reviewed it at the canyon mouth while his deputies loaded Cross and his 2 men onto horses. "This is thorough," Aldrich said, with the tone of someone who has seen a lot of incomplete paperwork. "I wanted to make it easy," Eleanor said. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. "You practice law, Mrs. Thorne." "I'm not admitted to the bar." "That's a shame," Aldrich said, and put the documents in his bag and rode out. Silas stood beside Eleanor and watched the deputies lead Cross away down the canyon road. Cross didn't look back. He had the look of a man who had already begun some internal revision of events, constructing the version where this was someone else's fault. It didn't matter. The documents were real. The witnesses were real. The dam was gone, and the water was running, and the case was in federal hands. Silas looked at Eleanor. "Builders," he said, quietly. It took her a moment. Then she remembered what he'd said to Clara, in the outline of this moment they'd discussed at the kitchen table, that justice belongs to the law, that they were builders. He'd meant it, all of it. She took his hand. They walked back up the canyon toward the horses, Clara between them with dried tears on her face and her chin up, stepping over the scattered timbers of what had been Cross's dam, the river bend running clear beside them in the early morning light. 1 year later, Ironwood Ranch looked like a different place. It was the same land, the same sweep of Wyoming plain, the same ridgeline to the north, the same river bend moving clear and easy through the south pasture. But the feel of it had changed the way a face changes when the person behind it stops being afraid. It had opened up. It had let itself be seen. The south pasture was full, 160 head, up from the winter-thin 80 that had survived the water crisis. 2 new hired hands brought the crew to 4, and Pete's bad knee had improved enough that he was back to full work and loudly pretended it had never been a problem. The bunkhouse had been repaired and expanded through the summer, which Martha had supervised with the iron certainty of a general conducting a campaign. The house had changed, too. There were curtains in the kitchen that Clara had chosen from the dry goods catalog blue, because Clara had decided blue was the correct color for curtains, and Eleanor had agreed without reservation, recognizing that this was important to Clara in a way that had nothing to do with curtains. There were drawings on the wall beside the stove, Sammy's, horses and cattle, and once, unmistakably, a large explosion, which Silas had looked at with complex feelings and then framed anyway. Sammy was talking, not in the tentative, testing way of the early months. He talked the way a 5-year-old talks, constantly, on every subject, with absolute confidence in the relevance of his observations. He had opinions about the horses, about breakfast, about which of Pete's stories were true and which ones weren't, about the correct way to stack firewood. He delivered all of these opinions to whoever was nearest, and whoever was nearest listened, because it was still something of a miracle, and probably always would be. He called Eleanor Mama. He'd started in August, about 3 months after the canyon. He'd said it casually, in the middle of a sentence, about something else entirely. And Eleanor had been at the stove and had not reacted visibly because her back was to the room, which was fortunate, because she needed a full 30 seconds before she could trust her face. Clara had been present. She'd looked at Sammy and then at Eleanor's back, and then gone back to her book without saying anything, which was Clara's way of saying she approved. Clara was 12 now. She was studying mathematics from a text Eleanor had ordered from Denver, the same press that published law references, because Clara had announced in February that she intended to become an attorney and wanted to begin preparing. Eleanor had written to 3 lawyers in Cheyenne, asking which subjects they recommended, and had shared the responses with Clara, who had drawn up a self-study plan and was executing it with the systematic ferocity she brought to everything. The women's suffrage movement was making noise in Wyoming Territory. It had been making noise for years. Wyoming had granted women the right to vote in 1869, the first territory in the nation to do so. And now there were women practicing law in limited capacities in Laramie and Cheyenne. Eleanor had been following the developments in the territorial papers for months. She'd started drafting a letter to the Wyoming Bar Association. She hadn't told Silas about the letter yet. She would. She thought she knew what he'd say. He'd probably say something practical and plain-spoken, and then he'd probably go find something heavy to move so she couldn't see his face while he dealt with being proud. She knew him well by now. It was a Sunday in December when Eleanor found the crib. She was cleaning the attic, a project long deferred, because the attic was large and full of things that accumulated over the years of a working ranch and nobody's first priority. Silas had built the attic over the original structure, and it still smelled of new lumber at the far end. The crib was in the back corner, under a length of canvas, old, well-made, the kind built to last. She pulled the canvas off and looked at it. She knew what it meant that it was there. Anna Thorne had set it up before Sammy was born, probably, or possibly for Clara. Silas hadn't been able to move it after. The objects that are hardest to remove from a house are the ones that hold the shape of the person who is gone. Eleanor looked at the crib for a while. She thought about Margaret Hayes, standing on the Denver platform, barren and useless. The verdict delivered in front of witnesses, intended to define everything. Eleanor had carried that word for a long time. The way you carry a stone you've forgotten you're holding until your arm starts aching. She had not become pregnant in the year at Ironwood. She might never. She did not know, medically, what the truth of her body was. And she had come to understand that she didn't need to know in order to know who she was. She had 2 children. They were asleep downstairs right now, on a Sunday morning, because Eleanor had learned that Sunday mornings were sacred in this house. For exactly that reason, everyone stayed in bed until the sun was properly up, which in December was not early. And then Martha made a large breakfast, and everyone ate it slowly with no particular agenda. Sammy had called her Mama. Clara had shown her where the shale was loose on the canyon wall so she could come back safely from the fight. These were the definitions that mattered. She began taking the crib apart. It was well joined, and it took some effort. But she was not a person who was deterred by effort. She separated it, piece by piece, and carried it in sections down from the attic and out to the woodshed, where the kindling was kept. She set it beside the splitting block. She looked at it. Then she picked up the axe and went to work. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about everything that needed doing. The old wood split cleanly good dry hardwood, years seasoned. It would burn hot and long. She stacked the pieces with the other kindling and hung the axe back on its peg. She washed her hands at the pump in the yard and stood for a moment in the cold December air, looking out across the south pasture. The cattle were moving slowly in the morning light, dark shapes against the pale field. The river bend was a line of silver at the pasture's edge. The mountains north of the ranch were white to their midpoints, and the sky above them was the specific deep blue that only comes in winter at altitude, the kind of blue that makes you understand why people stay in difficult places. Footsteps on the porch behind her. Silas came out and stood beside her. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one. And they stood together in the cold morning, looking out at the ranch. He didn't ask what she'd been doing. He'd seen her carry the wood out. He could read a situation. It was in the attic, Eleanor said. I know, he said. I couldn't. I know, she said. I did. He was quiet for a moment. Was that all right? To do that? Yes, she said. I think so. For both of us. He turned to look at her. Silas didn't look at people lightly. When he looked at you, he was actually looking, seeing what was there and not what was convenient. It had unnerved her in the early months. She was used to it now, and more than used to it, she understood it as the thing it was. Respect, full and uncomplicated. I wrote to the Bar Association, Eleanor said. He looked at her. In Cheyenne, about admission requirements. There's a woman in Laramie who submitted an application last spring. The situation is moving. Slowly she paused. I haven't heard back. I might not. But I sent it. Silas was quiet for a moment. If they said yes tomorrow, what would that mean for the ranch? I'd practice locally, Decker's Crossing and territory. I wouldn't need to go to Cheyenne. She looked at him. There are enough people in this territory being treated unfairly who need someone who can read a contract. I know that better than most. Yes, he said. You do. He looked back out at the pasture. I think you should do it, whatever comes of the letter. She took a drink of her coffee and let the warmth of it move through her. Mama Sammy's voice came from inside, high and immediate. Mama, Clara says it's breakfast. Clara's in charge of breakfast now, Silas said, at a volume calibrated to carry inside. I heard that, Clara said from the kitchen. Eleanor turned toward the door, then stopped. She looked out at the ranch one more time. The cattle, the river, the mountains, the sky, the land they had bled for, the home they had made out of desperation and practicality, and something that had grown, slowly, into something she didn't need a better word for than what it was. She thought about the woman on the platform in Denver, the 43 cents, the dead stove, the blizzard, pressing at the windows of that empty depot. She thought about a man filling a doorway with frost on his collar, looking at her the way someone looks at something unexpected, and then deciding, quickly and completely, what to do about it. She took Silas's free hand. Fingers intertwined her scarred palm against his calloused one, and they stood for one more moment in the cold December sun, looking out over the empire they had built from necessity and stubbornness and 2 people refusing to quit. Then they went inside for breakfast. The fire was going strong. Martha had already put the biscuits on. Sammy was sitting in his chair, with his horses lined up along the table's edge, narrating something to them in a low, serious voice. Clara was at the stove, with the particular expression of someone who has taken charge of a situation and intends to be acknowledged for it. Silas sat down. Eleanor sat beside him. Clara turned from the stove with a pan and served everyone in order of who needed it most. which she had determined by her own calculations, and then sat down and picked up her fork. Sammy looked at his plate, looked at Clara, looked at Eleanor. "Good breakfast," he announced, with complete authority, and picked up his spoon. Clara looked at the ceiling. Silas looked at his coffee cup. Eleanor looked out the window at the Wyoming winter, pressing clean and white and enormous against the glass. Outside, the river bend ran on. The cattle moved in the south pasture, easy and well-fed. The mountains held the sky up at the north. Ironwood Ranch sat solid and real in the middle of all of it, rooted deep in the ground they had fought for and won. Some things, once built properly, hold. This was one of them. And so, as the river bend continued to flow past Ironwood Ranch, carrying life back into the fields that had once been left dry and dying, Eleanor Thorne finally understood that the greatest victories are not always measured by land, money, or the defeat of a powerful enemy. Sometimes, victory is a warm kitchen on a winter morning. It is a little boy who once lost his voice calling you Mama. It is a guarded young girl quietly sharpening your pencils, warning you about loose shale, and trusting that when you ride into danger, you will find your way home. It is a man who does not ask you to become smaller so that he may feel stronger, but instead stands beside you, takes your scarred hand in his, and calls you his equal before the whole world. Eleanor arrived in Wyoming believing that everything important had already been taken from her. Her husband was dead. Her home was gone. Her inheritance had been stolen. And the cruel judgment of another woman had followed her all the way to that frozen railway platform. She had been called barren and useless, as though a woman's entire worth could be decided by whether she had given birth. But Ironwood taught her a deeper truth. Motherhood is not only carried in the body. It is carried in the hands that bandage wounds, in the arms that hold a frightened child, in the patience that waits without demanding, and in the courage to love children who are afraid to love you back. Eleanor did not replace the mother Clara and Sammy had lost. She honored that loss by helping them live beyond it. And in doing so, she became their mother not through blood, but through 1,000 quiet choices made every day. This story also reminds us that love does not always arrive with music, flowers, and beautiful promises. Sometimes it arrives wearing a frost-covered coat and offering a practical bargain in the middle of a blizzard. Silas and Eleanor did not begin with romance. They began with necessity. Yet necessity became respect. Respect became trust, and trust slowly became a love strong enough to survive winter, violence, grief, and fear. Their relationship endured because neither of them tried to rescue the other by taking away their strength. Silas gave Eleanor shelter, but she helped save his ranch. Eleanor gave his children warmth, but they gave her a family. He knew how to read stone, cattle, weather, and danger. She knew how to read contracts, motives, patterns, and people. Alone, each of them was capable. Together, they became nearly impossible to break. That may be one of the most important lessons Ironwood leaves behind. Real partnership is not about one strong person carrying someone weak. It is about two wounded people recognizing the strength in each other and building something neither could have built alone. Eleanor's battle against Jedediah Cross also teaches us that courage is not the same as anger. There were moments when a gun might have seemed faster than the law, and revenge might have felt more satisfying than patience. But Eleanor understood that the enemy wanted Silas furious, reckless, and easy to destroy. She defeated Cross not by becoming like him, but by remaining disciplined, observant, and prepared. She used the knowledge others had dismissed, the intelligence society had refused to recognize, and the painful lessons she had learned during her own legal defeat. What had once been a source of suffering became the very weapon that protected her new family and helped other ranchers reclaim their dignity. Her story reminds us that the things which once broke our hearts can one day become the tools with which we rebuild our lives. No experience is wasted when we have the courage to learn from it. Even failure can become wisdom. Even rejection can lead us toward the place where we are finally valued. And even a train ticket that carries us to the end of the line may secretly be carrying us toward the beginning of everything. Perhaps that is the deepest meaning of this story. A home is not simply the place where we were born, the house we inherited, or the name written on a legal document. A true home is built through loyalty, shared burdens, forgiveness, and the decision to remain when leaving would be easier. Eleanor entered Ironwood as a stranger with 1 suitcase and 43 cents. She stayed long enough to become its heart. All characters and situations in this book are fictional and developed for narrative purposes. The author does